Hello everyone, welcome to your lecture on development communication. This lecture is part of your paper Internationalizing Development Communication. This module deals with the concept of internationalizing development communication. You have already had an idea what is meant by development communication and its different theories in some of the previous modules. Review of development literature suggests that developed nations acquired and applied technological knowledge much faster than the developing nations. Technological knowledge emerged most authoritatively in the Europe that was encouraged by the rise of the merchant class. Such dominion placed it over other nations in terms of capital and power. International perspectives of development communication. Development mediations are not new, and the modern concept of development communication dates back to the era post Second World War. There had been colonization of most of the Third World nations post the World War II, and it was followed by the establishment of United Nations and its several multilateral agencies, making the onset of development in the underdeveloped countries. Soon after, a number of bilateral agencies were formed within the industrialized Western nations. International development theorists have conceptualized development from different perspectives. Interestingly, the perspectives changed with the evolution of different paradigms, and this led to changes in the policies of communication and other communication related technologies. Role of communication has always been a subject of extensive assumption within the theories of development. Development communication finds its origin in the disparity between the materialistic development and the industrialized nations and the developing nations. There are several schools of thoughts which have considered communication as a vital infrastructure of developmental process. Some have viewed it as an important component for the economic growth, whereas others have viewed it as an integral part of the social transformation process and modernization. Exploration of the different approaches of development discloses the patterns of developmental communication and discontents within it. Analysis of the communication history reveals that during the 1920s, the state was the main agent of communication between different countries. With the evolvement of social research tools, international communication scholars studied how the media was used by the state in the battlefields. Post the Second World War, US and its expanding firms became an enabler of the private capitalized markets. Scholars argued about the consequences of selling news and information worldwide, just like any other business product. The main concern raised was that selling of news and entertainment in the form of commercial services would dominate the imagination of majority of the world population living in a complete different situation. Further, the expansion of the local and converged technological infrastructure had initiated the new communication ways between non-government organizations or actors and non-profit organizations across different countries because of the limited infrastructure offered by the state and the corporates. Eventually, these alliances of the public interest group have questioned the multinational and state-supported entities. Scholars have claimed that the main purpose of international mass communication were established basically in social and political contexts during the 1930s and 1940s. Interestingly, at the end of 1950s, the international communication studies emerged were mostly US-centric. The earlier communication researchers assumed the purpose of communication in the context of war. Over the course of time, the concepts and theories of communication did not change even though the context underwent massive transformation. The perspectives of development communication have changed not only because of the different paradigms, but also because of the global changes in the social economic setup, as well as communication and technological innovations. In summation, from the analysis of the international development literature, we can say that the notions of communication have changed with time and different theories have suggested ways of implementation of development strategies and different efforts. Theorization. The modernization theories supporting steady economic growth were primarily concerned with the industrialized culture where the notions of development were already institutionalized. Such theories did not explain the exact role of communication in the development process and considered it like any other element. We notice how colonization of the world took place after the Second World War, and out of the experiences emerged certain dualistic theories. These theories focused on the problems of different underdeveloped countries. Further, the alternative theories focusing on the balanced and unbalanced structures of the north and south peripheries demanded for substitute requirements of growth in nations with different marginalized conditions. Different theories emphasizing on human capital investment stressed on aspects such as education and literacy as the impetus for the development, whereas entrepreneurial theories supported the role of economic elites. We know how the elite and developed class controlled the production and transmission of media content in developing nations. Such biases in the form of knowledge gap and role of diffusion provided an insight about the failures of the modernization theory of development. The Marxist approach of development regarded communication as a fundamental yet not influential part of the developmental process. The differences in the ideologies created the issues of class struggle, and the contemporary Marxist model takes on the political, cultural, economic ideologies when considering the aspect of development. On the other hand, the elite and classified models emphasized on the role of intellectuals, businesses, and politically superficial classes in the process of social transformation, especially in the developing nations. Social mobilization concepts of development have put emphasis on the communication policies and the role of participatory communication. It particularly focuses on the role of mass media in the decision-making process, mass mobility, and social mobilization for developmental support. The diffusion supporters consider development as a process within the spread of innovative ideas. The diffusion approach stressed on material diffusion. As per Marshall McLuhan, each theory helped in the determining the meaning of developmental communication, and each historical era of development was characterized by the media being used chiefly. Development literature during the 1950s and 1960s have suggested that mass communication has been a pivotal agent for social development. By the 1970s, the Third World Development Communication researchers started to contest the style and pattern of the Western world-dominated communication research processes. Thus, we see that there was an evolution of alternative paradigm giving rise to the conceptualization of development support communication. Its primary priority has been to bridge the communication gap between the advantageous and the disadvantageous communities. It is an inevitable fact that every development situation has its own complexities and constraints, and the local level development effort is eventually inseparable from the wider global structures. we see that in the present 21st century, the exponential growth of the information and communication technologies and the process of globalization phenomena has decreased the supremacy of any particular nation. In such a scenario, the nature of communication intervention has also undergone a massive change. To the global practitioners and theorists, development communication is necessarily meant as a dynamic factor for the vital change and progress. The path of development that was the dominant paradigm showed the way to emulate processes of industrialized world coupled with the rejection of their traditions and customs, which were considered archaic, conservative, and opposing the aspects of development. World War II was a major turning point, after which international aids, interventions, and beginning of modernization, planning, and schemes started to develop. During the modernization phase of development, it was viewed that the third world nations should emulate the economic model of the Western industrialized world in order to modernize themselves. The modernization task was to be achieved by walking through 5 different stages. The first stage was the traditional society. In order to reach the next stage of development, there were certain prerequisites such as political stability, which was the second stage. This was essential for sustained economic growth, which could be identified as the third stage. The fourth stage was identified as the maturity of economic and political institutions, which finally paved way for the fifth and the final stage, which was modernization, characterized by high consumption rates, high rate of GDP. The transformation from the stage 1, which is the traditional society, to stage 5th, which is the modern society, required new attitudes, progressive economic models, new work ethics, supportive public policies, and many other aspects, all of which were to be disseminated among the masses through the use of development communication. The dominant paradigm and its critique. What we noticed in the process of development under dominant paradigm, the indigenous styles, practices, culture, traditions were looked down upon the modern methods, which were viewed and presented as saving and upliftment, the downtrodden sections of the society. This model emphasized that new approaches of development were to be communicated to the larger audiences through the use of mass media. The trickle-down theory of development communication rather created a knowledge gap between the haves and the have-nots. The modernization paradigm emphasized on the transfer of media and communication infrastructure that created the limitations in accessing of media content in the third world. Urbanization and industrialization further created the problems of illiteracy and shortage of basic amenities. The modernization paradigm created increased dependency, and thus the alternative paradigm emerged. As per this paradigm, many of the ideas and strategies from the developed countries were taken and customized and fine-tuned to the needs of the people of different developing countries. The primary purpose was to improve the lives of the people, their communication and media habits, socio-political scenarios of the nations, the economic growth, as well as their culture and many other aspects. The critiques of modernization have viewed communication and pointed out that during this phase little attention has been given to the contextual or sociological factors of development. Further, the communication process that was studied empirically was short-term and far too generalized. The diffusion of innovation research that was introduced in the dominant paradigm turned out to be deficient because of the uneven distribution of resources. The socio-cultural, political, and economic situations of the industrialized nations were very differently from the countries of Asian and African continent. Yet, the diffusion model was uncritically advocated in the third world nations with the presumption that communication in any form can facilitate the development irrespective of the socio, cultural, and economic situations. In most of the developing nations, extension and extensive support agents were in shortage, and the support reached only to a fraction of the people. Technological innovations was thought to be the solution for increasing the productivity, regardless of thinking who would be benefiting out of it in the long term. Communication was characterized by a global approach. Over the years, there has been an increasing skepticism with the modernization and the alternative models of development. It is increasingly believed now that various nations of the world have their own geographical peculiarities, social setup, and cultural blending, and have traced their own models of economic and social development, which have suited their social and geographical setup. Disseminating a monotonous development model of any one part of the globe to various other parts through a channel of mass media basically has shown disappointments in the system of economic determinism and cultural imperialism. It also has shown a narrow to the scope of developmental borrowing from any nation which is relatively smaller in size and is dependent on other nations comparatively with the larger nations both in terms of geography and economy. It is here that the concept of internationalizing development communication finds its genesis, that is, to identify and appreciate the various developmental models across the globe and to communicate its benefits to those parts which have previously been unaware of. We noticed how the notion of development was weighted down by certain evolutionary biases. The development communication was linear and one-dimensional majorly and functioned along a certain predetermined sets of objectives. Another theoretical bias could be observed in the UNESCO's 1961 suggested set of developmental indicators. According to these standards, every nation must have access to media and communication facilities. During the ongoing second and third decades of development, social structural growth was emphasized. Development theorists like Rogers 1960 argued about the necessity of social changes and communication significant for improving the overall quality of life. During this era, many of the underdeveloped nations have started to achieve the targets of media access. But regrettably, the development communication history have showed that having access to media facilities did not necessarily meant better communication opportunities or improved the overall cultural standards. Development communication indicators were found to be insensitive with small traditional and interpersonal modes of interaction, as they were thought to be not capable of bringing the desired social change. Thus we saw the emergence of big media like radio, television, which depended on the commitment of the government and fund availability. Further, the choice of communication indicated the model of development the nations were following consciously or unconsciously. What we understand from here is that the indicators of development communication served as the intermediary between the development theory and the development policies. New World Information and Communication Order. Interestingly, the modernization paradigm could also be well situated in the Cold War. The framework articulated development goals for Russia and the developing countries of the Southern Hemisphere. Communication was thought to be an enhancing factor for the overall economic growth. The involvement of international organizations shifted the focus from communication as a publicity tool to a more institutionalized instrument of international policies. After the numerous critiques of the modernization paradigm, the notion of development communication was recast by the practitioners in the context of developed and the developing nations. Scram argued about the international political communication influencing the mass media. Sibert, Peterson, and Scram invented the four theories of press in 1956 and provided a conceptual framework of the international communication in the Cold War context. The emergence of the media research characterized by the Cold War instrumentally posed for broader debates concerning the economic development and power relations. The study by Nordenstreng and Schiller, National Sovereignty and International Communication, addressed the theoretical issues of the applicability of the dependency model in the international communication. This particular study looked upon the role of broadcasting satellites in the national sovereignty and the need for a balanced flow of news and information. It was in the 1980s that the report of Many Voices and One World by Sean McBride was published as an outcome of International Commission for Studying Communication Problems in the Third World. This report further provided specifically an overview of the relations between the communication and the society and the international imbalances in the content and the flow of information from the first to the third world. It initiated a debate in the sphere of international communication research and called for a new world information and communication order for enhancing professionalism of the media personnel and national sovereignty. It reflected the need of ensuring democratic communication, rights, and access to media individuals. The 1980s was also considered as a crisis period reflecting Western hegemony following the Cold War, increasing the debt and decreasing developmental support. This period was also marked by the emergence of journalism education and international communication research focusing on the telecommunications. Gaps were identified in the levels of accessing of telephones between the nations and other worlds in the holistic research of communication, offered an alternative approach for dealing with the issues of international communication. Different developing nations also witnessed new sources of development aid and technological expertise. The main motive of international communication exchange was to contribute to greater market economy and social integration in the less developed nations. The end of Cold War saw the emergence of many new nation states beginning in 1990s. Development scholars and social scientists enlisted nation building and development projects. With the information and communication technologies becoming an important part of the international trade economy, economists jumped on the opportunity of open investments in technological services. Since the 1990s, the focus of international studies was primarily on the economic analysis. Apart from this, some scholars also raised the issue of complexities of relations between nations, states, and how social communication conditioned the international politics. Moreover, there had also been a shift in the UNESCO studies that moved from international news flows to cultural communication. There have been shifts in the media industries in the international circle with more unions, partnerships, and acquisitions. There has been a growth of communication studies outside Europe and America. Communication perspective of the development. A critical development communication model is based on communication patterns involving information and feedback about the development strategies and programs. Theorists have opined that the communication perspective on development have viewed it as a structure of specific set of roles and patterns of actions through which social structures are modified. It is also true that the actions performed by people are defined by social conditions. If we try and analyze development from the communication perspective, then we may derive that many actions which are not defined as communication in its definitive sense are also a sort of communication efforts for development. We can visualize that development is a communication form and not any such particular economic and political process that gives less significance to the communication factor. There is another perspective of communication in development, which is interaction process among planners and agents of change. The United Nations defined the decade of 1960s as the first decade of development and had set the economic targets for the underdeveloped nations. In the 1960s, the emphasis on development communication shifted on the technological transfer from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. It was the traditional communication practices in the developing countries that sustained for ages. Social structures in the developing nations underwent a change under the influence of different paradigms. It also implied that development communication strategies underwent changes and in some phases were successful and in other times they were inappropriate. Development practitioners pointed about the components of social changes and improved cultural milieu for achieving growth in a community. The alternative paradigm emphasized on the social innovations for material growth. The main elements of development included proper administration, political leadership, and participation of masses by generating awareness. In conclusion, we see that different shifts in international communication research from the post-World War II period till the 1990s and the aspects of the development communication were anticipated in every paradigm. What we mainly learnt from this module is that the theories of development gave an insight of the perceived meaning of communication. What we mainly learnt from this module is that theories of development gave an insight of the perceived meaning of communication in different decades of development. The perspectives of development communication have changed not only because of different paradigms but also because of the global changes in the socio-economic setup as well as the communication and technological innovations. From the analysis of the international development literature, we can say that the notions of communication changed with times and different theories suggested ways of implementation of development strategies and efforts. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.